Hi everyone, welcome to this symposium on the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on the mental health, health behaviors and care situation in the Netherlands. The symposium consists of presentations, each focusing on different outcomes, and each based on data from the same ongoing cohort study in the Dutch general older population. The study is called the Longitudinal Aging Study Amsterdam. Originally, this symposium would be chaired by Professor Martijn Huisman. However, he's currently attending the council meeting, so therefore I will chair this session on his behalf. And my name is Omar Kok. I will also be the first speaker. I work as assistant professor in the Amsterdam University Medical Centers, in the departments of epidemiology and data science, and the Department of Psychiatry. And my presentation will focus on the consequences of the pandemic for mental health. Then the second speaker will be Dr. Laura Schaap. She is epidemiologist and assistant professor at the Department of Health Sciences at the VU University Amsterdam. And her presentation will focus on nutrition and physical activity behavior. Laura Schaap will be followed by Theo van Tilburg, Professor of Sociology and Social Gerontology at the VU University Amsterdam and Director of the Research Program Participation in Society. He will talk about emotional and social loneliness during the pandemic. And then finally, Marjolein Roese van Groenau will present about changes in the care situation of older adults in the Netherlands during the COVID pandemic. And she is Professor of Informal Care at the VU University Amsterdam and also head of the Department of Sociology. As you will know, the presentations are pre-recorded and they will be shown immediately after each other. In total, they will take about 45 minutes. So please save any questions until the end of the fourth presentation, and then we will have time for questions for any of the presenters. Of course, you can also pose your questions in the chat during the symposium, and then I can ask them at the end to any of the presenters. So please enjoy the symposium. And as far as I'm concerned, the first presentation can be started. Thank you. Hi, everyone. My name is Omar Kok, and I will present about exposure to COVID pandemic-related adversity and mental health in Dutch older adults. As I am the first presenter in this symposium, I will first tell briefly about the COVID-19 situation in the Netherlands. And as the other presenters will also use the same data set as I do, I will also briefly introduce the Longitudinal Aging Study Amsterdam to you. So first about the COVID-19 pandemic in the Netherlands. Up until now, there are about 8 million confirmed cases of COVID-19 on a total population of 70 million. And we have had about 22,000 COVID-related deaths. In the past 2 years, we have had several lockdowns, including school closings, a nighttime curfew, and also a massive downsizing of regular care because of the high numbers of COVID infections and patients on the intensive care. This is a graph showing the daily deaths accountable due to COVID-19 infections between March 2020 and July 2021, which is approximately the period in which we gather data on the COVID-19 experience in older adults. Then more about the data. We use data from the LASA COVID-19 study, which is part of the ongoing Longitudinal Aging Study Amsterdam. This is a cohort study that started already in 1992. And then it included about 3,000 adults aged 55 to 84 who were followed every 3 to 4 years in face-to-face interviews, medical interviews, and postal questionnaires. And then in 2002 and 2012, 2 cohorts were added of adults aged 55 to 64. You can find more information about the study on the website and also links to cohort profiles. Then in between the regular wave in 2018-19 and the currently ongoing regular wave, we collected twice data using a questionnaire about the COVID pandemic. And we did this in June to October 2020 and March to August 2021. And these data were gathered by postal questionnaire or online questionnaire. We also published recently a profile paper describing this study in more detail. Then what data did we collect? Well, first, of course, we had a lot of items covering COVID-19 related stressors, such as being infected with the virus or experiencing negative impact on healthcare, home care, on lifestyle, social contacts, and other negative events. And we also included a lot of regular measures that were already included in the previous regular waves of the LASA study, such as self-rated health, functional limitations, depressive and anxiety symptoms, and mastery or perceived control over life. Based on the COVID-19 specific items, we also calculated a COVID exposure index. This was based on 35 yes/no items, where we counted the number of items to which the participants said yes, and these reflected all kinds of negative experiences related to the pandemic. And we scaled this count to a score between 0 and 1. This is the frequency distribution of the scale, with an average of about 0.25 and approximately normally distributed. So after this general description, I will move on to the specific research questions on mental health. First question was, how did the mental health of older adults change in the first 1.5 years of the pandemic? How did pandemic-related exposures affect mental health in older adults? And the third question, what protective and buffering factors can be identified? First, a bit more about the terminology in the latter question. So what do we mean with protective and buffering factors? With protective factors, we mean factors that are associated with more favorable levels and changes in mental health in general. So suppose we have a data set with mental health measured at 3 time points. So 1 pre-pandemic and 2 during the pandemic. And suppose we measured social support and internet use. And we observe that those with high social support and high internet use have more favorable mental health trajectories. We can estimate these effects using main effects in regression models, and we would conclude that social support and internet use are protective. However, if we do this, we implicitly regard the pandemic as a homogeneous exposure. So we pretend as if everyone is exposed to adversity related to the pandemic in the same way. So therefore, we also estimated so-called buffering factors. And these are factors that protect against the effect of individually measured adversity on mental health. So suppose we have the same data set and we have a measure quantifying on an individual level the extent of pandemic-related adversity that people experienced. Then we would hypothesize that the higher the pandemic-related adversity, the worse the mental health trajectory. So that's the red arrow. Now we have the same data on social support and internet use. And if these are buffering factors, we would expect that the effect of pandemic-related adversity on mental health is weaker in persons who have a lot of social support or frequently use the internet. So this is what the arrow would look like. We can test this using interaction effects in regression models. So by estimating these effects, we can identify factors that are particularly important in a context of specific adversity. So here that is pandemic-related adversity. And we tested both protective and buffering effects in this study. We looked at 3 outcomes, namely depressive and anxiety symptoms and loneliness. Also, because we had 2 measures of COVID-related exposure, we made a cumulative COVID exposure wave with twice the 35 items and a total score of 0 to 70. Now, these are the potential protective or buffering factors that we included: partner status, network size and internet use, functional limitations and vaccination status, praying or meditating, mastery or perceived control over life, and neuroticism, which is a measure of emotional stability. So those with low neuroticism have high emotional stability. And finally, also education and income as potential protective or buffering factors. The statistical analysis comprised of 3 steps. First, we calculated descriptive statistics of the mental health outcomes and the other variables. And we calculated the change score of mental health between 2018 and 19 and the second COVID questionnaire, because we were really interested in longer-term changes in mental health. And finally, in linear regression models, we estimated main effects of COVID exposure and potential protective factors. We estimated interaction effects between potential buffering factors and COVID exposure. And we adjusted all models for age, sex, and also for pre-COVID mental health to really isolate the changes that took place after the last pre-pandemic measurement wave. Now to the results. We had data for about 900 participants who were aged about 72 years, and about half was female. The average score on the cumulative COVID exposure index was 14.5, and about 75% of the sample had a partner. Now, these are the observed mean scores of depressive and anxiety symptoms and loneliness. And we see that in both COVID years, the scores are on average higher than before the pandemic. But only for loneliness, the scores continue to increase between 2020 and 2021. The results from the main effects are that we found that higher COVID exposure was associated with an increase in depressive and anxiety symptoms and loneliness. And this association was strongest for loneliness. We also found that those who used the internet had a weaker increase in depressive symptoms. Those with a larger network size had a weaker increase in anxiety symptoms and loneliness. Those with higher neuroticism had a stronger increase in depressive symptoms and anxiety symptoms. Participants who prayed more than once a day versus not at all had a weaker increase in loneliness. And those with higher mastery had a weaker increase in depressive symptoms. So we found several protective effects of psychological and social factors across the 3 outcomes. Then we found few buffering effects. I present here the effects with a p-value below 0.1 because of the lower statistical power of interaction effects. And we found that those with a partner, the effect of cumulative exposure on loneliness was weaker. So this was a buffering effect. And in those who were vaccinated, the effect of cumulative exposure on depressive symptoms and loneliness was weaker. However, in those with higher mastery, the effect of cumulative COVID exposure on loneliness was actually somewhat stronger. So to conclude, we found a large heterogeneity in the extent to which people were exposed to specific stressors during the pandemic. So this is important to take into account and to not regard the pandemic as a homogeneous exposure. Then we found that internet use, a larger network, lower neuroticism, and higher mastery were related to more favorable mental health outcomes, actually regardless of the level of COVID exposure. And we found only a few buffering factors. The most evidence was for vaccination. And we conclude that vaccination also seems to have some psychological favorable side effects. Although I must mention that only 5% of our sample was not vaccinated in the second COVID questionnaire wave. So that was it. Thank you for your attention and many thanks to the co-authors and the LASA team.
Good afternoon. I will present my results on the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on nutritional and physical activity behavior in older adults. Now, due to the COVID-19 pandemic, many public health measures were installed with the aim to reduce the spread of the virus. And these measures included physical distancing, closing of nursing home, for example, and strict rules for visiting the supermarket. And these measures had a large impact on the daily lives of many people. And due to the measures, there was less participation in all kinds of daily activities. People were more likely to become isolated and lonely, and it was more difficult to visit someone. Older people might have received less help from others with daily activities, for example, with grocery shopping and cooking. Furthermore, there was a fear of infection because older people were considered a risk group, and people therefore also stayed at home more. And it has been suggested that especially the older adults were experiencing this negative impact of the pandemic regarding nutrition and physical activity, which may eventually increase the risk of becoming overweight, malnourished, sarcopenic, or increased risk of developing disabilities. There are three research aims. The first was to investigate the self-reported impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on nutrition and physical activity behavior in older participants of the longitudinal aging study Amsterdam. Second, to investigate the change in behavior between the first COVID-19 wave in 2020 and 1 year later. And three, to identify subgroups of older adults who might be more susceptible to the negative impact of COVID-19 on nutrition and physical activity behavior. Now, we used data that were collected with the COVID-19 questionnaires in the LASA study, and the first questionnaire was sent out in 2020, and the second questionnaire almost a year later in 2021. Participants were aged 62 and over, more than half was female and higher educated. And 2.9% experienced COVID-19 in 2020, and this was increased to 7% in 2021. 958 participants with full data on nutrition and physical activity behavior were used in the current study. Now, in the questionnaires, the following questions were asked about nutritional behavior. Due to the corona situation, are you having trouble obtaining groceries? Do you skip warm meals? And do you eat less than usual? Furthermore, due to the corona crisis, to what extent do you have the feeling that you eat too little or that you lose weight? You are gaining weight, you snack more than usual, or you drink more alcohol than usual? And the answer categories were always, sometimes, never, or I don't know. Now, questions about physical activity were, due to the corona situation, are you less physically active than usual? And are you exercising less than usual? And due to the corona crisis, to what extent do you have the feeling that you are not physically active enough or exercising enough? And the other answer categories are still always, sometimes, never, and I don't know. Now, there was also some other data that we used, which came from the regular Lhasa wave of 2018 and 2019, which can be seen here on the left. So they are age, sex, region, household composition, body mass index, physical activity, self-rated health, functional limitations, and whether they had been in quarantine or not. The statistical analysis included descriptive analysis and logistic regression analysis to test associations between characteristics as independent variables and reported impact on nutrition and physical activity behavior as dependent variables. And these variables were therefore dichotomized. And this was done in order to investigate subgroups. Here you can see the characteristics of the participants, and the mean age was 73.4 years, 52% was female, almost a third was living alone, and more than 50% of the participants reported one or more functional limitations. About 36% was overweight or obese, 27% reported a fair to poor self-rated health, and 36.7% was physically active for 150 minutes per week or more. Now, due to time restraints, I will show part of our results. First, examples of behavior predisposing to overnutrition. And here you can see that 3.4% of the participants reported to always snack more during the first wave, and 29% reported to do this sometimes. And together this means that a third of the sample was snacking more than before the pandemic in 2020. In 2021, a similar picture was seen, with a slightly higher percentage of people reporting to have the feeling that they always or sometimes snack more than usual. Now, almost a third reported to always or sometimes have the feeling that they gained weight in 2020. And in 2021, this percentage was increased to 39.3%. And we also found here that especially older adults who had been in quarantine reported the feeling of gaining weight. And that was about 53% of the participants. So that is a really high percentage. And also behavior predisposing to undernutrition was reported. 11% reported to sometimes eat less than usual in 2020. And in 2021, this was slightly increased to 12.5%. Then in 2020, almost half of the participants reported to always or sometimes be less physically active than usual. And this was unfortunately still the case 1 year later. When we analyzed potential subgroups that may be more susceptible to unhealthy nutrition and physical activity behavior, we could identify several subgroups. So for behavior predisposing to overnutrition, which can be seen on the complete left, these were women, young old persons, persons with poor self-rated health, persons with a low physical activity, which was already low before the pandemic, and persons who were already overweight before the pandemic. And for behavior predisposing to undernutrition in the middle, subgroups that could be identified were again women, old persons, persons who were already underweight before the pandemic, persons who were living alone, and persons with functional limitations. Subgroups for low physical activity were women again, young old persons, and persons with functional limitations. So in conclusion, participants of our study reported an impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on their nutrition and physical activity behavior. This was behavior that is linked to overnutrition, for example, snacking more and gaining weight, but also behavior that is linked to undernutrition, for example, eating less than usual. And about half of the participants reported to be less physically active, which is a very high number of people. Unfortunately, we did not see any improvements in these behaviors 1 year later. And we also identified several subgroups that may be more susceptible to unhealthy behavior. And our results can therefore help identify those older adults who would benefit from specific attention to behavior and behavioral change regarding nutrition and physical activity in order to avoid under and overnutrition and or avoid aggravation of problems, such as being overweight, which some of these problems were already present before the pandemic. And this was my presentation. I would like to thank you for your attention.
Hello. I want to present my research that's on the increase of emotional and social loneliness during the pandemic and based on a longitudinal study. With the spread of the COVID-19 virus and illness, the Netherlands and many other countries implemented a policy to keep citizens physically at a distance. Well, on the basis of theory and previous research, I formulated two hypotheses. The first hypothesis is that loneliness increased during the pandemic and that we will find the strongest increase in emotional loneliness. The reason for that is that people were emotionally affected by the societal disruption. And of course, one of the consequences of the pandemic was that many countries had a policy to limit contact with other people. So you might also expect that social loneliness increased. But at the same time, it's expected people lower their relationship standards because people realize that meeting with family events was practically impossible. And a second reason was that people experienced solidarity because there were so many other people who were in the same boat. So they were also affected by the policy measures to fight the pandemic. Second hypothesis is that being socially integrated and having access to resources makes people less prone to increased loneliness. And you see on the screen what we measured for the social integration, that is having a partner, a large personal network, frequent contact with others, and participation in social organizations. For resources, we looked to those who had better health, had a higher mastery, higher self-esteem, higher educational level and income, which all are expected to decrease the likelihood of the onset of loneliness during the pandemic. The data are from the longitudinal aging study Amsterdam. This is a study that is in the field since 1992. There are various main studies, up to 10 nowadays, and there are in between sub-studies on various topics. And two of these are during the pandemic, we had also sub-studies on the consequences of the pandemic. I selected the community dwelling respondents who were aged 75 or older at the time of the observation. For the first hypothesis, so the first hypothesis on the development of loneliness, I use all the available data between 1992 and 2021, and of course I focus on the period just before and during the pandemic. For the second hypothesis, that means on protection by social integration and resources, I use only the observation just prior to the outbreak of the pandemic, time 0, and the observation from fall 2020, time 1. In this graph, you see the development in emotional loneliness from the years 1992 to the end of 2021. with the help of all the data that we have on loneliness. Please note, this is only emotional loneliness shown. The percentage that is on the left of your screen is the average agree with an item score. What you see is that since 1992 up to about 2009, there's a small decrease in loneliness. It is a small decrease. It is significant. We have reported on this data elsewhere. Then we have a period of about, well, not changing level of loneliness between 2009 and 2018. And after the outbreak of the pandemic, there's an increase in emotional loneliness, and the highest level is observed in April 21, so somewhat more than a year after the outbreak. At that time, there's a 9 percentage point increase compared to 2018. The difference is significant, as you can see from the confidence intervals. And then finally, in the fall of 2021, we observed a decrease in loneliness, which is also significantly different from the observation in April 2021. Well, more recent data are yet not available. In this graph, you see the regression model with, on the left, the time zero variables, 3 types of loneliness: emotional loneliness, social loneliness, and existential loneliness. And on the right, you see time 1 variables, the 3 types of loneliness. What you see here in the middle is that a strong continuation of the level of loneliness with betas in the regression model between 0.45 to 0.52. On the left, you see also that we measured social integration variables and resource variables. Various of these variables were related to the time zero variables, but our interest is in the longitudinal effect. And that's indicated by the lines with the different colors. First, we see that having a good physical functioning and a high mastery protects against the increase of loneliness during the pandemic. And by the way, it affects all types of loneliness. And the betas are minus 0.11 and to minus 0.15. We see that social integration variables do not protect against the rise of loneliness during the pandemic. In contrast, we see one variable, that is church attendance frequency, displayed in red, with a beta of 0.09, which increased emotional loneliness. Contrary, of course, to the hypothesis 2. So, a short summary, being socially integrated protects against loneliness cross-sectionally, but there was no excess value during the pandemic. And the high frequency of church attendance before the pandemic the effect of that variable might indicate that the older adults in our study missed live church services, and that the online variants that were provided at the time did not provide the same level of connectedness, or it's of course possible that they were not capable to follow these online variants due to a lack of equipment, for example. And finally, we see that good physical functioning and a high mass are very important in protecting the older people. So the isolation measures affected various categories and not only older people living alone. That means that when we want to develop efforts to combat loneliness, we should not focus only on groups that traditionally are seen as vulnerable. So not only focus on, for example, people living alone, but also people, older people living with their spouse. That there is an effect of resources in predicting the increase, protecting against loneliness during the onset of the pandemic is in itself good news, of course. But we know that it is very difficult to change, to develop a policy to change these resources in a positive way. And therefore, we should develop targeted policy that focus on reducing the negative input of not having these resources. Thank you very much. We are happy to answer questions after the presentations.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. This presentation is about the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on the care situation of the Dutch older adults. The focus is on long-term care of home-dwelling older adults. Long-term care concerns care from informal, formal home care or privately paid care to persons that need help with daily activities. During the pandemic, in the first phase, there were several measures taken that may have impacted on the long-term care use. The first was that no visitors or informal caregivers were allowed in residential care. Daycare centers shut down and formal home caregivers cut down the frequency of their visits. And finally, of course, there was social distancing. So it was more difficult to see family and friends. These measures may have contributed to lower availability of home care, lower availability of informal care from outside the household, and an increased demand for informal care within the household. And this brought us to the general question, what are the consequences for care and well-being of older adults? And more information on the topic will help us see what consequences there are for informal care if formal care is more restricted, given that the principle of substitution is leading here. But it also gives us more information on the number of people that risked losing care or that managed to receive and provide care, and those who didn't. It also gives us the opportunity to study how objective and subjective perspectives on changes in care align. And lastly, it will show how changes in care, if any, impact on the well-being of older adults. So we made a distinction between older adults using care and older adults providing care to others. Regarding the use of care, we asked the question, how did the use of formal, informal, and privately paid care change during the pandemic compared to 1 year before? And how did the change in care use, if any, impact on care recipients' well-being? Also, with regard to the provision of care, we ask about changes compared to 1 year before and how the change of care provision impact on the well-being of the caregiver. So we use the LASA main study in 2018-19 and the first COVID questionnaire in the summer of 2020. The sample for this paper is about 1,000 respondents and limited to those for whom information on care use or care provision was available. Important here is to note that the COVID questionnaire was not sent to the most frail elderly in the LASA sample who are likely to use care. Still, the sample consists for a small majority of females, 53%, and the average age is about 73 years of age, ranging from 60 to 100. So questions on care use were asked for 3 types of care: household, personal care, and nursing care. Respondents could indicate 12 types of caregivers and indicated how many hours of help these types of caregivers provided. And the variable that we use in this study is a very general one. It's the use of either formal, informal, or privately paid care for at least 1 hour per week. And based on the information we have on both measurements, we construct a variable on change. So, a distinction between never using care, always using care, quitting the use of care, and starting the use of care. We also asked about the subjective perception of a change in the care received, and we asked about the sufficiency of care. So the same we did for the provision of informal care. Respondents indicated whether and for how many hours they provided care to whom, inside or outside their household. And we constructed the variable on the change between the provision of care and the 2 waves. So never providing care, always providing care, stopping providing care, and starting providing care. And we also asked about their subjective feeling of providing more help since the start of the pandemic. And those were, then we had 4 categories: not applicable, didn't provide help, provided the same amount of help, I provided less or far less of help, and I provided more or far more help. The indicator of well-being was the depressive symptoms as measured by the 10-item version of the CES-D. And we also added data on background variables and health as controls in the analysis. And we will provide information on the numbers of change, numbers of respondents that changed, and we will focus on how change in care use and provision add to depressive symptoms. So the first descriptive results are about the change in the use of care. And they show that about 62% never used care, which is a pretty large majority in this sample. In addition, 70% still received care, but for 15%, the care use had stopped completely, while for only 5% care use started during the pandemic. Regarding the provision of informal care, we see that even a larger majority that did not provide care at all, but nearly 15% stopped providing care. And we did a further analysis on that group, and it showed that this mostly concerned the care provided to friends and neighbors, which might be the consequence of the social distancing measures as people stayed home more often. The next slide showed in a bit more detail the percentage of users by type of care. It shows that the informal care was rather unstable, with about 7% quitting or starting the use of informal care, but that the use of formal home care was rather stable. Those that used it, small percentage, but still remained using it. It also shows that the use of privately paid care was more the one that stopped during the pandemic. This slide shows the relationship between care use and care sufficiency. And it shows that the proportion of respondents who were not or less satisfied with care use are relatively high in the groups that always used care or that started using care. So there is an association between care, the change in care, and the satisfaction with care. This slide shows you the descriptives of the mean depressive symptoms at the 2 times of measurements by the group that used care. It shows you that the depressive symptoms increase for all groups, but in particular for those starting the use of care. But more importantly are the multivariate regression analysis. And this shows you how the change in use and provision of care are associated with depressive symptoms. The multivariate regression analysis controlled for depressive symptoms at the first measurement, the background variables, and the health status. It shows you that those who use care or started to use care show more depressive symptoms compared to the ones never using care. Also, being not or less satisfied with the care received also contributes to more depressive symptoms. Regarding the provision of informal care, we see that those who perceive to provide more care show more depressive symptoms, but the objective change in care provision is not related to depressive symptoms. We can conclude that only a small part of the older adults did not receive care anymore, and this mostly concerned privately paid care. Where formal care use was remained, informal care was either started or quitted. And the use of care was clearly correlated with depressive symptoms. The conclusions regarding informal care provision is that a small part quitted using care, in particular, providing care, in particular to friends and neighbors. And only the perception to provide more care was associated with depressive symptoms. There are several points for discussion. The majority of the group did not use care, and this is likely the result of excluding the most frail elderly in the COVID pandemic questionnaire. Second, social distancing can be the reason why care to non-kin and care used from privately paid sources was stopped. And it is likely that with the finishing of the social distancing measures, these types of care may have picked up again. Thirdly, the social distancing did not impact the use of formal home care and the provision of informal care. Fourth, care use does impact well-being, but we need more analysis to conclude that this was in particular the case during the pandemic. It's always the case, as we know from other studies, but there are also other factors during the pandemic that may have impacted on well-being, like loneliness or lack of social contacts. So we need more research, in particular longitudinal research, to study whether care use and the quitting of care provision may have impacted the caregiver and care users' well-being as well. Thank you very much, and I'm ready to take any questions.
All right, welcome back, everyone. Thank you to all the presenters for their overall clear and interesting presentations. We have a few minutes left for Q&A, so I will start right away. And we have a question from the audience by Stefan Geyer. I will pose this question to Professor van Tilburg. The question is, I am familiar with the loneliness scale by de Jong-Gierveld, and but to what exactly does existential loneliness refer? And I think this means conceptually as well as how it is measured, with which scale.
Thank you for this question. It's a very good question, by the way, because it's a new or relatively new concept that is added to the emotional and social loneliness. The definition of existential loneliness, is that it relates to the awareness of one's fundamental separateness as a human being, as also referred to as meaninglessness. And I've done a study on it, published in the Gerontologist in 2021. And there it shows that the concept is quite far from the social and emotional loneliness.
All right, thank you, Professor van Tilburg. I also have a question for Dr. Schaap. You pointed out that there was some deterioration in health behaviors. So now we are 1 year further in the meantime. So what do you think the situation is now? You often hear like you have to use it or lose it. Is it true that people who start to change their behavior, then it's harder to return back? Or do you think that it will return to normal now that the pandemic is less severe in the Netherlands? What do you think?
Thank you. That is it's a very important but also a difficult question. And to be honest, at this moment, I don't know. What we do know from data also from the Netherlands, when it's regarding physical activity, we see that within the COVID-19 waves, so also within lockdowns, for example, you see that people start moving more again. So there seems to be bad behavior during the worst times of COVID. And when public health measures are lifted, you see that people start becoming more active again. So that's good news. Whether this is true, that was based on data from younger adults in the Netherlands. Whether that is also true for older people, we don't know yet. So we really have to wait for research that is now coming out, I think, and see whether people start returning to their usual behavior or whether they really have adopted this new behavior. And if that is the case, that is, of course, bad news. Yeah.
All right, thank you. And maybe a similar question for Professor Broese van Groenau. You used data from the first COVID questionnaire of the LASA study. Have you also looked already at the second COVID questionnaire, and otherwise, what do you expect from that data? Was the situation with cancellations of care, or was it different in the second COVID wave?
Well, the first, this presentation showed you the impact of social distancing on the provision of care to neighbors and friends. So I think that whenever during the second lockdown, so in the fall of 21, this will have shown the same effect as in the first lockdown, because that's, well, I think we can conclude directly connected to the measure of social distancing. So that was, I think that's pretty, clear. With regard to the use of formal care, the results also showed that they weren't changed that much. So and given how the situation in the Netherlands evolved during the second lockdown, home care organizations were still able to provide care to people living at home. So that was, I think, an expectation that didn't change anymore. And with regard to people living in residential care, visiting measures were also far more open, and people were more allowed to visit their spouse or mother or father in the residential care again, well, with protection, but that was still possible. So I think that in the second wave, the changes will be even less negative.
All right, that would be good. And then one final question, so we can end this this symposium in time. It's again a question to Professor van Tilburg, and also a bit about my own analysis. So you found that the church attendance was associated, pre-pandemic church attendance was associated with increase in loneliness, whereas in our analysis we found that praying, for example, was associated with less increase in loneliness. So this seems to be contradicting each other, but well, maybe it doesn't. Do you have any explanation for this, apparent contradiction findings? Or is there a logical explanation?
I hope that the explanation is logical. I think that we are talking about two different concepts. One of the concepts is that you are visiting a church and attend the service, and at that time you see people and you can meet each other. Sometimes they drink coffee together after the service. So it's really about meeting. So when at a pandemic that the services were not allowed anymore, at most places at least, and they transferred it to online meetings, and then you miss the contact. While praying, most praying is done in yourself. So that's about how you cope individually with, with the anxiety, with the stress of the pandemic. So therefore the concept might be, and it might help you, of course, in praying, the relationship with God might help you to cope with the consequences of the pandemic.
Yes, thank you. So I think that reconciles these two findings. So I will now wrap up this symposium. Thanks to the presenters and thanks to the audience for attending. And well, the longitudinal aging study Amsterdam is still ongoing. We are now collecting data in new regular wave. And if you are interested in looking at those data or perhaps using these data, then please visit our website. And you can, I'm sure you can find it via Google. So thank you everyone and enjoy the rest of this Congress.